Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. I've always loved going to my granny's house, but with her living about 7 hours away, I only got to visit about once or twice a year for only about 2 to 4 days. My granny is mostly Native American and loves nature. She always puts a lot of belief into all sorts of haunted stories she's heard from family. About 2 years ago, when I was 13, my parents decided to send me to my granny and papa's for a month in the summer because I had told them I liked the rural area she lived in rather than the city we lived in. Can you blame me? Nicer people, cleaner air, beautiful pieces of land, I've always loved it and much preferred it. When my parents first left me there, it was the same as always. My older brothers, who were 22 and 27, both also lived in that area with their wives and kids. They'd ask me about boys at home, and my cousins would decide to roughhouse with the youngest cousin and only girl. When I was little, my granny always wanted me in the house and in bed by the time it was dark, the same for anyone else who was staying in her house that night. She always said it was because of the coyotes. When I was younger, I never questioned it, but at 13, I definitely questioned why I had to be in bed. I could understand the part about being in the house, but not the part about being in bed. The first week, nothing special happened. But by the second week, I noticed some weird stuff. My belongings would go missing, then after extensive searching, I'd find them exactly where I'd left them. And trust me, I've never been a skeptic of the paranormal. My mom and I love watching shows like My Haunted House and such. I also own a Ouija board and tarot cards. So when this started happening, I immediately thought there was a spirit in the house, and I was kind of excited. But then the activity progressed. I would find stuff in my room that wasn't mine or anyone else's in the house, things like old combs, rock necklaces, and once even an old torn, dirty moccasin. Then around my third week there, I'd find myself awake and restless every night at about 3 a.m., which I'm pretty sure is the devil's hour from what I've heard, since Jesus allegedly died on the cross at 3 p.m. anyhow. I'd always wake up to a whining sound outside my window, like the sound of an injured animal, but something told me it was not an animal. After 4 nights of this, I finally ran to tell my granny. I'm not sure why, but that night, I had this terrible, panicked feeling like if I didn't run from that room, I would lose my life. That night, my granny sat me down in the kitchen and told me the story about a tribal elder from the Cherokee tribe who could communicate with the tribe's spirit guides. But he soon grew so powerful, he grew bloodthirsty. He used the spirit's powers to turn himself into different kinds of creatures, and in that form, he attacked the people of his own tribe for their flesh. When the chief found him out, he was sentenced to death and was quickly executed. It's said that during the day, he's nothing more than a spirit, but at night, he becomes a beast in search of human flesh to feed upon, but not just any humans, humans with Cherokee blood pumping through their veins, like me and my gran. Not much else happened during my stay. However, I did move my dresser in front of the window. But just 2 days before I was supposed to go home, my cousin Christopher Jean, who at the time was 15, stumbled home one night, very bloodied, and said he'd been attacked. He told my papa it was a coyote, but he told my granny and me that he only saw blurs of his attacker as it moved too fast, and he heard nothing but snarls. He yelled the Lord's Prayer, which put off the attack just enough for him to run home. My granny and I believe it was the spirit of the elder. I am 18 years old, and I grew up in Michigan. I have lived in the country for as long as I can remember. One particularly hot summer weekend, a couple of friends of mine, including my boyfriend, let's call him Tony, and my older brother, let's call him Brad, decided to go camping for the weekend. We figured, why not? It was such a nice, warm week, and Tony's parents owned a cabin way out in Ludington, surrounded by a huge wooded area with a private lake and no neighbors for at least 4 miles in any direction. But being stupid teenagers, we thought about the isolation as a good thing, more privacy. All we were ready for was to party like any normal teens would. Well, after we got there and set up for about 2 hours, the fun started. Tony's friends brought tons of alcohol and weed to last us the whole weekend so we wouldn't be bored, especially since we had no cellular service and only movies to watch. Before we knew it, it was midnight, and it was pitch black outside, so we got a big bonfire going. There were 6 people, including me and Tony, out there. As we talked and laughed about upcoming events in our lives, we were so distracted that we didn't even notice that my brother had literally frozen his eyes onto one section of the woods. Now, keep in mind, at the time, we were all intoxicated and high. Eventually, our talking ceased when Tony realized his friend and my brother had an emotionless expression. "Hey, dude, you alright?" he asked Brad, but there was only silence, no reply. Brad didn't even make any movements to indicate that he'd hurt him. After a few moments of awkward silence from Brad, I began to get a little freaked out. It took a lot to faze my brother, so it was very unlike him to act like that. Eventually, I was the first to actually question what he was staring at. He wasn't even blinking, just staring into one spot in the woods. I turned my head to follow his gaze as best I could, and when I finally saw what he was staring at, my heart sank. There, right there, was what appeared to be a dog at first look, or at least that's what I thought. I was assuming it was some person's dog that had wandered off, but then my brain kicked back in, and I remembered that we didn't have neighbors for miles. So how could there be a dog here? My mind was still racing while Tony tried to get Brad to speak or even move. In one motion, this thing that I thought was a dog began to stand, and by God, it was tall. And when I say tall, I mean massive. It must have been at least 6 feet tall. Everyone saw it, how could you not? I heard a few people behind me gasp in unison as they finally understood the gravity of the situation, of why my brother was as still as a stick. No one moved for what seemed like hours. Eventually, Tony was the first to speak. "No, no tail," he mumbled. No one heard what he said but Brad and me. I swear to you, I'm not exaggerating when I say his eyes widened as big as pan saucers. Seeing that expression on his face, that look of terror, it scared the hell out of me. "What did you say?" one of the girls asked behind me. "It has no tail," he repeated to her. My heartbeat seemed to stop in that moment, because he was right. Whatever that thing was, there was no tail on it. This was no creature I'd seen before. Suddenly, my clouded, alcohol-soaked mind cleared up in a fraction of a second, because my scared mind made a guess at what this thing was, and I suddenly understood why my brother was basically pissing himself. This thing, it was a skinwalker. My instincts kicked in right then and there, but before I could nope the hell out of there, that thing before us screamed an inhuman scream. That sound was enough to scare the hell out of everyone. My brother was the first to get out of his chair. He began to shout native words at the creature. I turned and solemnly told everyone else that we needed to get inside, now. No one questioned me when they saw how serious I was, especially Tony, who's never seen me so scared. I think we all understood this was a bad situation. We all hightailed it into the cabin with my brother in tow, still shouting native words at the creature, which seemed to keep it at bay long enough to get inside. Once we were all in, Brad followed, slamming and locking the door, before turning all the lights off. He ran into the kitchen, opened an old, dusty drawer, then pulled out these ceremonial ashes, which he started to sprinkle on the doors and windows while chanting. Of course, the whole situation was so bizarre. We were all petrified, and a few of us were in tears. After he was done, no one said a word, and for the longest time, we were silent. We were all just in shock. At one point, Brad grabbed our dad's pistol and had it beside him for hours. Everyone was entirely too shaken up to even question what just happened. We must have fallen asleep at one point, because when I woke up, my brother was packing all our stuff into the 2 cars. I understood why. We had Navajo heritage. We knew what we were dealing with. We knew it would be back, and it might not be alone. Before we left, I did a blessing on the cabin, speaking a few calming words in my native tongue, and I tried my best to calm the still very freaked out girls as we loaded into the cars. To this day, we still haven't explained exactly to our friends what happened that night or what we saw. Then again, they never wanted to ask. I live on the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin. Growing up here, paranormal and mysterious activity is something that most of us, and probably Native Americans in general, have grown accustomed to. We have our own local police force, and this story was told to me by one of the officers who has been employed there for quite some time. He will stay anonymous for privacy reasons. Our reservation is laid out with many tribal housing areas surrounded by dense woods and trees, which the tribe is known for. One night, this officer and his partner were called to what was initially thought to be a domestic violence incident, a sadly common occurrence around here. The caller had reported hearing people screaming, fighting, and the sounds of glass breaking and shattering within a specific residence. The two officers rushed over to the residence. As they approached the house, they too could hear screaming, kids crying, and what sounded like the place being destroyed from the inside. The officers knocked on the door, but the commotion continued, so they decided to bust the door down for safety reasons. Once inside, they found the house completely dark. They flashed their lights around, but there was no one there. There wasn't a single piece of evidence to suggest any violence had taken place, and the entire residence was empty. Both officers left, deeply creeped out by the experience. They don't talk about it much, from what I know, but to be honest, it didn't surprise anyone around town. Strange experiences like this are almost normal here. I hope to have more opportunities to share these eerie stories from around our dark heritage. This is a story I was told as a young child, one my grandmother used to share with me. My grandma was Cherokee, and she would tell me about the old days when the Cherokee Nation covered much of the southeastern United States. She would often speak of the Nunhai, or Stone Man, a creature from Cherokee beliefs. This monster is described as a human-like being with skin as hard as stone, which no weapon can pierce. When my grandma was a little girl, her father, my great-grandfather, took her hunting in the woods of Kentucky to get food for their supper. As they reached a river bottom, they spotted an elderly man with a cane. He looked filthy, wearing ragged clothes full of holes. My great-grandfather saw the man's face and called out, asking if he needed help. Oddly, the man didn't respond, so he called out again, "Sir, do you need any help?" The man remained silent. Then, suddenly, a large deer came running toward my grandma and great-grandfather. My great-grandfather quickly pulled my grandma aside as the deer ran past, seeming not to notice them. But things became even stranger when the elderly man finally turned to speak. He simply said, "I like that little girl." My grandma began to cry, praying that everything would be okay. The next thing she knew, the man pulled out a gun and began shooting toward them. As he did, his skin turned a grayish color, like the stones on a path. He shouted, "When I catch you, I'll eat you, then lay you down to die." While my grandma was crying in terror, my great-grandfather's dog, Tuiki, came charging down and attacked the man. My grandma could hear the sound of the dog's teeth gnashing against the man's skin, yet it seemed like the dog was chewing on rock. The man only smiled as the dog bit into his arm. Then, as if it were nothing, he lifted the dog off the ground and began to bite him. My great-grandfather, a strong and fearless man in his day, had a look of dread and terror on his face. He grabbed my grandma and ran back through the forest, away from the horrific scene. But soon they heard loud, heavy footsteps behind them. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, they turned back, and there was the man, the same distance away as before, with a bloody grin and a lifeless Tuiki in his grasp. He was laughing. My great-grandfather didn't stop until they were fully out of the forest, and when they looked back one last time, the man was gone. Out in the open again, they finally felt a sense of peace and safety. My grandma shared this story many times during her life, and she even had a journal entry about it from when she was a child. I'm 3/4 Cherokee myself, and to this day, I won't go into those woods. I fear that the stone man, the nun high, might be waiting there still. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.